Welcome back to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to give you guys a general overview of all of the chess openings, very briefly teaching you what they are so that you know what they are when you hear about them, and maybe it'll pique your interest in learning a new type of system. So let's start with the most popular move for white, pawn to e4. This is the classic move. It's the quickest way to get developed. Puts a pawn right in the center, controlling center space. So traditionally, what players would do when a pawn hit the center, you would put a pawn back in the center, meet the fourth rank with the fifth rank. So pawn to e5 or pawn to c5. Let's start with c5, the Sicilian. So this white pawn is controlling light squares. Note how this black pawn is controlling a dark square on d4. It's also trying to trade a wing pawn for a center pawn. So now after, for example, knight f3, d6, d4, black's able to take. In long term, this is a better pawn structure for black. Having these pawns on the king side and these only two on the queen side allows black to put a rook on c8 and apply pressure to this extra c pawn for white. And then white does not have a d pawn, right? So black has an extra center pawn and this pawn to pressure on c2. So in the Sicilian, there's a couple main systems for black. After knight f6, knight to c3, oftentimes you'll see players either play a6 or g6. Knight to c6 is another option as well. So if you start with a6, this is the Najdorf defense. Najdorf defense is very sharp. Maxime Vischer-Legrave plays this quite a bit. It's probably the most technical system that you can play, maybe in all of chess. Like both sides can get really good attacks going. Oftentimes white castle's queen side, black castle's king side. So this is called the Najdorf variation. Extremely sharp. Let's now look at knight to c6. This is called the classical variation. And oftentimes if white wants to play aggressive, they'll play bishop g5, which is called the Richter-Rauser variation. These can also be very sharp. White tends to castle queenside, black kingside, pawn storms for both players. The next option is g6. This is the Sicilian dragon. The dragon is sharp and it's aggressive for black, but it actually scores pretty well for white at the top levels. So for club level, this is fine to play, but for super GMs, I would not recommend playing the dragon variation. I don't know how many super GMs watch this channel though, so maybe that's a moot point. So Sicilian dragon, pawn to g6. Now let's back up to move number 2. So after your knight f3, instead of d6, other ways that black can play this that are common are e6 and knight c6. Knight to c6 oftentimes will transpose into a system with d6 and knight f6, but there's a unique system that could be played, pawn to e5, and this tends to go knight here to b5, d6, knight 1 to c3, knight f6, bishop g5. There's a couple different names for this, but I always hear this called the Sveshnikov variation. I kind of like the Sveshnikov positions for both sides. I think they're very interesting. Magnus plays this quite a bit for black, or at least he did for a stretch. I believe he played it against Caruana in the World Championship match. These are fun dynamic systems from both sides. Interesting pawn structures. On move 2, what I've played most recently as a regular option in my repertoire is pawn to e6. These are more solid systems than when black plays d6 because instead of fighting for the dark squares, you're actually getting ready to castle more quickly. This bishop can come out, knight out, and castle. And you're supporting the d5 breaks. You're fighting on the light squares. It's a little more solid for black. So after knight c3, there's a couple ways you can play this. a6, Sicilian Khan variation. Knight c6, the Taimanov variation. Those are the main two. I personally kind of like knight to c6. But you can also go knight f6, and you can try to transpose this. Let me show you an example. Let's just say knight c6, then knight f6. This can transpose into d6, bishop f4, e5, Sveshnikov that we already looked at. But this can also transpose into bishop e3, d6, the Cheveningen variation. This was common in the Kasparov-Anand World Championship match. Extremely solid for black. I feel like white gets a little more fun in these positions with the king side attack because usually both sides castle king side, and white will get to kind of expand over here. But it's a good option for black and very solid for both with same side castling. The other things that white can do in the Sicilian instead of knight f3 are the closed Sicilian, knight to c3, or the C3 Sicilian, also called the Alapin variation. This is what we recommend in our E4 course, or D4. And after C takes D, C3. This is called the Smithmore Gambit. It's a very sharp system for white, and you can definitely get black with some tactics early on. All right, let's move on now to pawn to E5. This is double king pawn. And after knight f3 and knight c6, we have the Roy Lopez. It's a classic system, probably the strongest way to face e5. And then we also have the Gioco Piano. This is sometimes called the Italian game as well, as chess.com calls it. This has lately become more popular because the Roy Lopez runs into the Berlin defense. I'm not going to go into that in this video, but some players have been switching back to bishop c4 more recently to try to avoid the Berlin defense. At this point, you could play other moves like the King's Gambit or the Bishop's Opening or Knight to c3 as well. All right, now let's look at the French defense. Here, d4 is most common, and after d5, you can play the winnower, knight to c3. You can play the Tarrasch, knight to d2, the advance, pawn to e5, or the exchange, e takes d5. So those are the four main systems in the French defense. Another one you might sometimes see is kind of a King's Indian attack setup, where white will go d3, knight f3, g3, and fianchetto. And they can do that against the Caro-Kann as well. So next, let's look at Caro-Kann, pawn to c6. So here we have d4, d5, and now we have the classic variation with knight to c3. This is pretty common. It used to be probably the main line for white, but more recently the advanced variation has become more popular. This is like a way for white to just grab the space early and make the game very sharp. But I think knight to f6 is the reason we don't see this as often at the high levels. This is kind of what we recommend. This is what we recommend in the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. It's the Tartakower defense. Um, I think black is kind of having the fun in these positions, and there's a lot of interesting ideas for black. But black also has options of bishop f5, the classical variation, and knight to d7, the modern or the Karpov variation. There's a lot of different systems black can play. Next, we have pawn to e5, the advanced variation. And here there's bishop f5 as the main line, and the trendy Botvinnik Karl's defense with c5. That's from our Caro-Kann course as well. We recommend c5, immediately attacking that central d4 pawn. White could also play e takes d, the exchange variation. And this can either be the exchange where bishop d3 gets played and c3 nice and solid, or it can transpose. Instead of being the exchange, it can transpose into the Panov attack, sometimes called the Panov Botvinnik attack, with pawn to c4. An aggressive system that oftentimes leads white with this isolated pawn on d4. This is another option for white if they want to try to press the Caro-Kann player. There's also the two knights variation. I think this is gaining popularity online. I know a couple chess streamers recommend this, and I've seen it quite a bit in Blitz. This is where white does not put that d pawn up on d4 right away. They start out with both knights, and it actually can cause some move order trickiness for black to figure out. So this is the two knights attack in the Caro-Kann. Now let's move on to d6, the Peert's defense. Peert's defense is a hypermodern opening, and black wants to fianchetto the bishop to g7 eventually, but they'll start knight f6, pressuring the e-pawn, then g6. There's a lot of systems here white can play. The Austrian attack with pawn to f4. They can do the 150 attack, which is bishop e3, queen d2, queenside castle, and then try to attack the black king over here. And they can play more classically like knight f3 and just quietly develop the bishops and castle. all good options for white. So Piert defense or Piert's defense, it's one of the better scoring black openings, like we talked about in the top 10 openings for black. It's an aggressive system, but I think the computer tends to like white with best play. And we could look at a couple more here. We'll do three more. Modern opening, G6, very similar to the Pierce defense. Bishop G7, and then oftentimes D6 is played right here, and you delay moving out the G8 knight. The reason you delay bringing out the G8 knight is because you can avoid some of the systems against the Pierce and play it in a slightly different manner where you don't allow that F6 knight to be kicked by E5. So oftentimes you can play like A6, B5, C5 for black, knight D7, and just leave that knight on G8 back there. The knight kind of helps defend this H6 square. It's not on F6 to be kicked by a pawn, and later on black can bring out the knight while trying to get this queenside play going and bishop on B7, knight on D7, rook C8, all of those moves. So that's the modern defense. Modern tends to score pretty well, and it's a good way to play for the win. You can avoid sort of dry drawish positions with the modern. Next, let's look at the Scandinavian defense. Pawn to d5. John Bartholomew's favorite, Team Scandi. It's sort of like a Caro-Kann, but the queen does get harassed on d5. So this is not liked quite as much by the computer because white can always grab this free tempo, picking the queen. And at this point, you might kind of wish that you had played a Caro-Kann in most cases. But there are some unique variations in the Scandi that some players like as black. And then we have the Alakins or the Alakins defense, knight to f6. After e5, the knight usually gets kicked a couple times with d4 and c4 in some move order. Knight ends up on b6, and then black finally fights back with d6. After e takes d, either pawn can capture. Sometimes the bishop gets fianchettoed. It's a modern way for black to fight back against the center using pieces and then later on pawns. And this is one of the top scoring openings for black at the club level. I think it's because black is kind of immediately making white extend those pawns, and white can tend to overextend the pawns, making it easier for black to gain the initiative. So that's all for the e4 openings. Let's look at d4 now. So pawn to d4 for white. We'll start with knight f6. This tends to be an Indian defense when you see knight f6. c4 is most common. And now e6. And at this point, knight to c3 was kind of the classic move that was played, but now knight f3 is gaining in popularity. So if knight to c3 is played, black usually pins this knight, and now we're in what's called the Nimzo Indian defense. In the Nimzo Indian, black wants to fight for these central light squares using the knight, and pinning this knight on c3 doesn't allow white to easily control those central squares. There's a few different variations that can be played here. This is called the normal line. We have the classical variation with queen c2, the three knights variation, the Kmach variation, probably mispronouncing that. Sometimes that's called the same-ish in the King's Indian defense. You play f3. So Nimzo Indian, one of the better systems for black. Computer really likes it. It's super solid. Here, white could also play knight to f3 or pawn to g3. Those can both lead to the Catalan system as long as g3 gets played. Catalan is very popular at all levels, and I'd say it's been popular since the early 2000s when Kramnik started playing it, right around the time he had his Kasparov match. Catalan is like this nice system where you get similar structures game after game, and you get long-term fianchetto pressure. So this kingside fianchetto just tends to score well. Like for both colors, putting a bishop on g2 or g7 always scores a little bit better than the other openings in practice. If knight f3 is played, black has pawn to d5, and this can go for Catalan with g3, or knight to c3 can be played. And now we're in what's called the Queen's Gambit declined. We kind of transposed into a d4, d5 opening, even though we started with knight to f6. So this is a QGD, Queen's Gambit declined. There's a few different variations here, but we'll get to this after in the D5 section. Black can also play pawn to B6. This is the queen's Indian defense. Another Indian defense. Black is letting the pieces do the talking first. Later on, black will bring the pawns out, probably C5 and D5. But first, black is fighting for these central light squares. Bishop to B4 check. This is called the Bogo Indian. The idea is white has to block. Black usually allows this trade, and then they'll figure out some way to kind of set up their pawns so they can create some positional weaknesses in the white camp. We also have C5. After D5, this leads to the Benoni. E takes, C takes, D6. The Benoni is a nice way for black to um, fight against the center dynamically. You allow white that big pawn up on D5, but it's also a weakness. You can fight against it. Benoni is a really fun system to play for both colors. Computer does tend to like white though, because white can, with best play, can sort of tie down black's development. So now let's back up to move 2. King's Indian defense, G6. White can go knight F3 here, G3. The most common, you're going to see knight to C3. Bishop G7 and E4. This leads to what's called the King's Indian defense. After the King's Indian defense, there's multiple ways for white to play this that are all good. Knight to F3 is the most common, followed by bringing the bishops to E2 and E3. But you'll also see other stuff like F3, H3, even F4 can be played. King's Indian defense, it tends to be better for white, according to the computer, and at the Super GM level, but it scores well for black at the club level. So I think it's an effective system for black to play aggressively and actively. And if black does not put the bishop on G7 on move 3, usually you're going to see D5. This is called the Grunfeld defense. Very highly regarded at the highest levels. Super solid, hard for white to gain an advantage. That's a dynamic, hyper-modern opening as well. So oftentimes you'll see take, E4, knight takes, pawn takes. Black gives white this massive center. Black is actually doing just fine here. They're able to fight back. Bishop G7, C5. This center is going to crumble eventually. And white really doesn't have much of an advantage here. So G6 leads to King's Indian and Grunfeld. C5 can lead to the Benoni or the Benko. The Benko Gambit is the #1 system for black at the club level. I love the Benko. So whenever you see this early C5, usually black's looking for a fight. They want to play aggressively. Now knight to F3. This is typically going to be the London, but it can transpose. C4, for example, is kind of the Queen's Gambit territory. Bishop F4. Now we go to London. Moving on to D5. After C4, we have the Slav defense. Queen's Gambit declined. Queen's Gambit accepted. And you can play a few gambits like E5. You can play knight F6, common at club level in Blitz, but not the greatest move. So this is called the Queen's Gambit, this structure. Typically, you're going to see Queen's Gambit declined or Slav. Every so often, you will see Queen's Gambit accepted. At this point, you could also play knight to F3 and bishop to F4. Go for a London. Or there's some other systems that are a little less common, like knight to C3. I think this, what is this one called? It's just calling it the Queen's Pawn opening. I think it's called the Verisov. And then the other thing that you can play on move 1 is pawn to C4. This is the English opening. And you can play knight to F3, the ready opening. So I kind of cruised through the D4 system a little bit and these other sidelines on move 1, the ready and the English. This is kind of a general overview in about 20 minutes of just getting familiar with the names of the openings. You can check these out on your own. This is the chess.com Opening Explorer. Go play through some of the lines, look at the stats, see what you like. I know for myself, when I started out playing, I didn't know any of the names of the openings. And I think it's actually beneficial to at least know what the openings are because sometimes in conversation or in research, you want to be able to think back, like, oh, yeah, I know the Benoni opening looks like this exact position. You can picture it in your head, use some different ideas from one opening to another. I hope you guys enjoyed this general overview of the openings in chess. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.